I still remember the exact moment they turned to look at me. Their laughter wasn't loud. It was worse. It was the kind of laughter people share when they're too proud to laugh out loud but too cruel to hold it in. The kind of smirk that pulls at the corner of the mouth like a secret joke you're not supposed to hear. But I heard it, and I felt it, in the pit of my stomach, like the punchline was me. It was my husband's cousin's engagement party, big, lavish, and dripping with pretension, held at the family estate, where chandeliers glittered like judgment and every woman sparkled in labels that practically shouted their worth. I stepped onto the marbled floor in a dusty lavender dress that cost me exactly $39.99, and that included shipping. It was elegant, I thought, soft satin, a delicate neckline, and a subtle slit that hit just below the knee. I wore it with simple nude heels and a small clutch I borrowed from my best friend. I had curled my hair, done my makeup carefully, and smiled at myself in the mirror before leaving. I felt beautiful. Not rich, not flashy, but beautiful. Until I got there. My sister-in-law, Lauren, was the first to raise an eyebrow. She clutched her champagne glass like it was a microphone for judgment. "Oh," she said, dragging the vowel like it was something to be cleaned off her shoe. "Vintage?" Her voice was too sweet to be sincere. Before I could respond, another in-law, one I barely knew, whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Or is it from one of those curated thrift stores?" They laughed. My husband didn't say anything. He just gave a tight smile and walked ahead. It wasn't the first time. Ever since we got married, I'd been walking a tightrope with his family. I didn't come from money. I wasn't a debutante, didn't belong to a country club, and had never vacationed in Saint-Tropez. I was the daughter of a single mom who worked 2 jobs to put food on our table. I put myself through school, juggled shifts as a waitress, and built a life with my own hands. But none of that mattered to them. To them, I was a charity case, a project for my husband to fix, a mistake. That night, I pretended not to hear them. I smiled politely, sipped my water, because of course they assumed I couldn't handle champagne, and found a quiet corner by the piano. I watched as the others swirled around me in their glittering dresses, clutching clutches that cost more than my rent, and still, I sat there with my back straight, my shoulders pulled tight, and my dignity intact. But something cracked, quietly, inside. The next morning, I cried in the bathroom while brushing my teeth. My husband was asleep, or pretending to be. He hadn't said anything about what happened, not about their laughter, not about how small they made me feel. Not even a simple, "You looked beautiful," and that silence said everything. I went to work that Monday like nothing happened. I walked into my job at the local gallery, small, independent, passionate. I wasn't the curator, not yet. I was just the assistant, but I loved it. I loved the smell of paint and dust, the stories behind the pieces, the quiet hum of creation that lived in every corner. That week, we were preparing for an upcoming installation, a new designer who had taken Paris by storm but wanted to launch something more intimate in the States. Her name was Celeste Moreau. Young, bold, mysterious. Her team had sent over a small trunk of design samples, and I had the honor of unboxing them. There it was, the moment that shifted everything. I opened the last box and gasped. Inside was a dress, soft lavender satin, identical neckline, identical slit, identical to mine. My hands trembled. I pulled out the tag. It wasn't a price tag. It was a note. This piece is part of the unreleased capsule collection titled Rebirth, inspired by everyday elegance, made to blend into a room and then quietly steal its breath. I froze. Was it possible? I called my friend, the one who had recommended the small online boutique. She checked the order, Turns out the boutique sourced independent designers overstock. They didn't list names, just descriptions and prices. And I had bought, unknowingly, a prototype of Celeste Moreau's next masterpiece. I laughed, out loud, alone in the gallery. It felt good, not like revenge, but like justice breathing down my neck. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I had a plan, a slow one, a quiet one, just like me. The event to unveil Celeste's collection was set to happen in 2 weeks, a private showcase by invitation only. And by some miracle or divine humor, my boss invited me to attend since I'd helped set up the installation. It was formal attire. I didn't hesitate. I took the dress out again, pressed it, treated it with reverence. I didn't need to change it. I didn't need to add anything. It was enough. I was enough. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of the mirror again, wearing the same $40 dress, this time with a quiet fire behind my eyes. I wore it like armor, like truth, like a memory of every time they laughed and every time I didn't break. When I arrived at the gallery, the room was already full. My in-laws were there too, invited, of course, because Lauren's husband was a donor. She saw me, and her mouth curled again. "Didn't you wear that already?" She whispered to her sister, loud enough again. I smiled this time. "Yes," I said, "I did." And then Celeste walked in, tall, elegant, radiant in a minimalist black suit. She scanned the room, eyes sharp and curious. When she got to me, she stopped. And then slowly, deliberately, she crossed the room. She moved like someone who owned the floor, not arrogantly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. People parted around her like waves as she made her way toward me, and I felt every set of eyes in the room shift to watch. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I didn't know what she was going to say. Maybe she'd demand I take it off. Maybe I had somehow broken some rule, embarrassed the gallery, crossed a line I didn't even know existed. I was half a second from slipping into panic when she stopped just inches from me. She tilted her head, then reached out and gently touched the hem of my sleeve. "That's my piece," she said softly, her voice low but unmistakably clear, "from the rebirth line. But this," she gestured at the way I wore it, the calm poise I was holding onto with every fiber of my being. "This is how I imagined it. Exactly this." I couldn't speak. She turned around, scanning the crowd without letting go of my gaze. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, and her voice rose just enough to command the room. "This dress," she held up my arm gently, "is the centerpiece of the collection. And the woman wearing it? She didn't borrow it. She didn't steal it. She wore it before anyone else could label it, before anyone else had the permission to." Silence, thick, electrified, and then a wave of camera flashes, polite applause, stunned whispers. I stood there, caught between shock and something deeper, vindication. I saw Lauren's face. Her mouth twitched like she wanted to say something, but nothing came. Her husband looked confused, like he hadn't yet realized the world had tilted slightly. I didn't move. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Celeste smiled at me. "What's your name?" I swallowed. "Eva." "Well, Eva," she said, lowering her voice again, "I hope you know you just gave my design its story. Thank you." Then she walked away, just like that, and the gallery returned to its usual buzz. But the air had changed. I had changed. People who hadn't looked at me twice before now nodded politely, complimented the fit, the cut, the color. One woman even asked if I was a model in the show. I said no, because I wasn't a model. I was the moment. Later that night, back home, I hung the dress on the back of my closet door and sat on the bed in silence. My husband hadn't come. He had said he was busy with work, but I knew he just didn't want to be there. He always said those events made him uncomfortable, even though they were his family's circle. deep down, I had stopped waiting for him to show up for me a long time ago. When he did come home around midnight, he smelled like bourbon and quiet resentment. He glanced at me, still in my makeup, still in the dress. "You wore that again?" he asked, dropping his keys on the counter. I looked at him, just looked. "Celeste Moreau called it the centerpiece," I said. He paused, then gave a small snort. "That's nice. That's nice." I turned away. Something cracked a little more, but this time I didn't cry. The next morning I arrived early to the gallery, still holding onto the electric thread of the night before. My boss greeted me with a grin. "Celeste loved you," he said. "She asked for your number. She wants you to help coordinate with her team for the full US launch. That could mean press tours, styling previews, maybe even travel." I blinked. "What do you say?" he asked. I said yes. Of course I said yes. In the weeks that followed, I started working directly with Celeste's assistant. I helped organize samples, coordinated interviews, and even got to contribute feedback on how her pieces were being presented. Slowly, I became more than just the girl who wore the dress. I became Eva, the capable one, the one with insight, the one who belonged in the room. Meanwhile, my in-laws seemed to forget the incident, or at least pretended to. At the next family gathering, Lauren approached me with a strained smile. "So," she said, tilting her glass again, "you've been busy." "I have," I replied calmly. "Fashion world now?" she asked, as if it were a hobby I'd picked up between grocery runs. "Professionally, yes." Her smile faltered. My husband stood nearby, silent again, watching. He had grown quieter lately, more distant. The more I stepped into myself, the more he retreated. Maybe he had always preferred me small, grateful, dependent. But that woman was gone. And the new one, she was just getting started. At home, I started sketching again, something I hadn't done since college. Designs, ideas, silhouettes, not to impress anyone, just to see what would happen when I let my hands tell stories too. One night, Celeste called me. "You know," she said, "I looked into that boutique you bought the dress from. It's run by a woman who used to intern for me years ago. She recognized the prototype but didn't realize it hadn't been officially released. Technically, you wore a piece of fashion history before it even began." I laughed softly. "All for $40, she chuckled. "Money never buys the moment. You do." Her words stayed with me. Weeks turned into months. I traveled once to New York for a showcase. Celeste invited me to sit in on one of her private fittings with a celebrity client. I didn't speak much. I didn't have to. Just being there was enough. I started building my own confidence like a quiet tower, brick by brick, dress by dress, decision by decision. And every time I saw Lauren again, every time she scanned my outfit for weakness, I stood a little taller. Because I had worn the dress first, not because I wanted attention, but because I knew who I was. And now, so did they. A year passed, and in that time I became someone I never imagined I could be, at least not in their world. I didn't buy a new wardrobe or start posting about designer clothes. I didn't flaunt anything. That was never the point. But I carried myself differently. I walked into rooms without shrinking. I answered questions without apologizing, and I started saying no. The gallery promoted me, not officially to curator, not yet, but close. I was now the lead coordinator for upcoming exhibits and special collaborations, including one with Celeste's latest sustainable fashion campaign. She'd taken a liking to me, not in a superficial way, but in a rare, respectful, professional way that made me feel seen, like my voice mattered. At home, things with my husband grew colder. He didn't like the new hours, the travel, the phone calls during dinner. But what he really didn't like was that I no longer asked for permission. I could see it in the way he looked at me now, not with pride, but with confusion, maybe even fear. I had changed, and he hadn't. One evening we were sitting at his parents' house for a family dinner. I had just come back from a week in New York and was still exhausted from back-to-back meetings. But I was invited, and skipping would only feed the narrative they whispered about me. Too good for us now, too full of herself. I wore a sleek navy dress, tailored, elegant, simple. I designed it myself. A sample I was testing before quietly launching a small capsule line. No one knew yet. Not even Celeste. Lauren glanced at it, tilted her head, and asked, "Where's that one from? Looks different." "It's one of mine," I said casually. The room quieted. "You design now?" she asked with a smirk. "I've always designed," I replied. "I just didn't have the freedom to show it before." No one laughed. My husband stared at his plate. His mother cleared her throat and changed the subject. But the shift had already happened. They no longer saw someone they could dismiss. I could feel it. That night, as we drove home, my husband finally broke the silence. "Why do you keep trying to prove something to them?" I turned to him. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just living. They're the ones who made it about status and appearances. I never cared about that." He didn't respond, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. 2 weeks later, Celeste invited me to join her team for a Paris preview event. It wasn't an official role, more like shadowing, learning, watching. She said it would be good for me, especially since I'd shared I wanted to start my own line. I was hesitant. My marriage was already fragile, and I knew what the trip would do to it. But deep down, I also knew something else. I was shrinking again. Not because I wanted to, but because I was being pulled back, slowly, silently. So I said yes. Paris was everything I had imagined. Not because of the glamour, but because of the energy, the way people there treated fashion as art, identity, expression. Celeste introduced me to designers who were changing the game. Women who looked me in the eyes and asked real questions. People who didn't care where I'd come from or who my in-laws were. They just saw me. One afternoon, sitting at a cafe in Le Marais, Celeste looked at me and said, "You're ready." "For what?" "To launch." I blinked. She leaned in. "You've got vision. You've got grit. And most importantly, you've got your own story. People connect with that more than you think." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I opened my sketchbook and started laying out the full collection I had only ever dared to dream about. Soft lines, clean structure, intentional details, a line inspired by quiet power, dresses that whispered, not screamed. When I returned home, everything felt sharper. My apartment felt smaller. My husband's questions felt heavier. "Did you meet anyone?" "What do you mean?" "Anyone. Out there." I looked at him, tired. "No, just myself." He didn't understand. He never would. The next family event was a gala, charity, formal, elite. Lauren, of course, was on the planning committee. She sent the invitation with a note. Black tie. "Please wear something appropriate." I almost didn't go, but I had to, because I had something to say without saying anything. So I chose the dress, not the lavender one, the new one. My first official piece under the brand name I'd registered that very week. Elan by Eva. It meant momentum, flair, spirit. The dress was deep emerald green, draped silk with structured shoulders and an open back that held its own kind of silence, understated, timeless, like me. When I walked into the venue, heads turned, not because the dress screamed for attention, but because it didn't have to. Lauren saw me. Her eyes scanned the dress, and I saw it. The flicker of recognition, not just envy, fear, because she knew. She knew something had changed and it couldn't be undone. I didn't walk over to her. I didn't need to. The press was there, photographers, influencers. I wasn't famous, but Celeste had whispered my name to the right people. "That's the woman who wore the prototype," someone said. And then someone else said, "She's launching her own line next season." By the time the dessert course was served, people were asking for my card, and when I left, I didn't look back. Not even once. A few weeks later, my mother called. She rarely did. She knew I was busy. But that morning her voice was trembling with pride. "I saw your name," she said, "on a blog, Fashion Now. They wrote about you." I pulled it up while she stayed on the line. There it was, the silent rise of Eva Laurent, the designer who let her dress speak first. My throat tightened. The article mentioned the gallery moment, Celeste's mentorship, and even the green gown at the charity gala. They called my style emotional architecture, something that lives in the body but holds a story underneath. My mother cried quietly. "You did this, Ava, with nothing but your own 2 hands." I remembered the nights she worked double shifts, the way she used to kiss my forehead, even when she came home smelling like fry oil and fatigue. I remembered how she once stitched my school play costume out of old bed sheets and said, "If it fits your dream, then it fits you." And now here we were. I sent her the first sample from my upcoming line. Not the most expensive one, not the flashiest, but the one that reminded me of her strength. Soft gray wool, tailored to move, built to last. She wore it to church the next Sunday, and she said everyone asked where it was from. When I told her the name of the brand, she laughed through her tears. "Of course it's French. You were always a little too fancy for the cafeteria." I smiled. "It's not about being fancy, it's about being free." That night, I sat at my work table, alone in the apartment. My husband had left earlier that day, claiming he needed space. I didn't ask where he went. I didn't ask if he was coming back. And for the first time, I didn't feel small because of it. I just felt still. I pulled out my sketches, fabric swatches, and a glass of wine. I played soft jazz from a dusty speaker in the corner, and I breathed. I was preparing for my first official preview. Nothing big, just 20 guests, stylists, bloggers, a couple buyers. I rented out a quiet rooftop space and planned every detail with precision. No blaring lights, no runways, just open air, soft piano, and the hum of city life below. It felt like the right place to begin. The morning of the event, I received a message from Lauren, a single line. He told me he moved out. I guess this is what you wanted. I stared at it for a long time, then deleted it. Not because it didn't sting, but because it didn't define me anymore. I wasn't the girl in the corner of the party anymore, holding a glass of water and pretending I didn't hear them laugh. I was the woman they whispered about now. At the preview, people came quietly, respectfully. They tried on the samples, touched the fabrics, asked about meaning. One stylist said, "There's something sacred in the simplicity, like it's telling me to come home to myself." I nodded. That's the whole point. Celeste arrived near the end. She didn't say much, just walked the perimeter of the space, touched one sleeve, adjusted a belt on another. Then she walked over and kissed me on the cheek. "You've arrived," she said. "No," I replied softly. "I've just started walking." The next week, a buyer from a boutique in Soho reached out. They wanted the entire capsule. They called it refreshing, humble, necessary. I signed the papers. My first official collection. That same week, I received an invitation to yet another family event. This time, it was a renewal of vows. My husband's parents, 40 years married. They were throwing a garden celebration at their summer home. And yes, of course, I was expected to be there. I almost didn't go. But something inside me said, this wasn't just another invitation, it was a moment. So I went, not out of spite, not to show off, but to close a door with grace. I wore a cream suit, clean lines, silk blend fabric, and no label. Just the inner tag that read, Elan by Eva. The jacket held my waist like a quiet promise. and the pants fell to the ankle in a sharp, elegant line. My heels clicked across the patio stones like punctuation marks. When I arrived, the room didn't stop, but it shifted. My husband's father came to greet me, stiffly. "Ava," he said, nodding once. "Glad you could join us." I returned the nod. "Thank you for the invitation." Lauren was there, of course, dressed in a gown that looked like she'd tried too hard. Her eyes scanned me up and down. No words, just a tight smile. Later in the evening, as speeches began and the family gathered in a circle, my ex-husband stepped up to say a few words. He thanked his parents, made jokes about their arguments, and said something about how love takes work. I watched him from a distance. He never once looked my way, but that was fine, because for the first time, I wasn't hoping he would. A younger cousin came over during dessert and asked if I was that designer his girlfriend followed on Instagram. I smiled and said, "Maybe." He pulled out his phone and showed me the account. My account. 15,000 followers. And growing. Later, as the sun set and people began to say their goodbyes, I stepped outside into the garden. Alone. The air was cool, crisp, filled with the scent of roses and pine. I looked up at the stars and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that settles in your bones when you know you no longer need to be anywhere else but exactly where you are. A few days after the vow renewal, I received an envelope in the mail. Thick, ivory, expensive. No return address, but I knew exactly where it came from. Inside was a formal invitation to a gala hosted by the National Design Council, a celebration of emerging talent in American fashion. My name was printed in gold foil near the bottom of the list of honorees. I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't applied, hadn't submitted anything, but someone had nominated me. Later that day, I got a message from Celeste. "Congratulations, you deserve this." That night, I sat on my balcony with a blanket wrapped around me, watching the city lights flicker like stars that refused to sleep. I thought about how far I'd come, not in miles, but in faith, in dignity, in breath. The day of the gala arrived quietly. I didn't tell anyone from his family, not out of spite, but because I knew the power of silence now. Let them hear it from someone else. Let them read it. Let it hit them slowly, like perfume left behind on a coat they didn't realize I had taken with me. I designed my own gown, soft white silk, high neckline, open back, long sleeves with delicate stitching that formed a winding vine across my arms. I wanted it to feel like evolution, like grace stitched into armor. When I walked into the venue, the air wrapped around me like it knew my name. There was no need to announce it. It was in the eyes of those who nodded, in the whispers that followed me down the marble corridor. It was in the pause before the photographers clicked. Celeste found me in the crowd and squeezed my hand. "This is only the beginning," she whispered. Later, as the names were read and the room applauded, I stood on stage with 9 others. Designers, stylists, creatives. And when it was my turn to speak, I took the microphone with hands that no longer shook. "I'm honored," I said, "not because I stand here as someone who was chosen, but because I once sat in rooms where I was laughed at, not for who I was, but for who I wasn't. I wasn't rich. I wasn't glamorous. I wasn't invited." I paused. But what they didn't know was that I didn't need their permission to arrive. I just needed to walk forward. The applause was soft at first, then swelling. Later, as the crowd dispersed, someone tapped my shoulder. I turned. It was Lauren. She looked different, tired maybe, or maybe just out of place. "I saw the article," she said. I nodded. "And the speech." More silence. Then she looked me in the eye for the first time in years, not with cruelty, but something like regret. "I was wrong," she said. "About you." I didn't gloat. I didn't lash out. I simply asked, "Why?" She blinked. Why what? Why were you so cruel? Her throat worked around the truth. Then finally, because you weren't afraid of us, and we didn't know how to handle that. I nodded again. Fear doesn't make you strong. It just makes you loud. She opened her mouth to speak again, but closed it. I turned and walked away, not to punish her, just to choose myself. After the gala, my phone buzzed constantly. Interview requests, collaboration offers, boutique invitations from overseas. I hired an assistant. I upgraded my workspace. I built a team. I was building a life. One that wasn't decorated in gold but rooted in grit. One that didn't ask, do they accept me, but asked, does this feel true? Months later, my collection officially launched in a small boutique in New York and a minimalist showroom in Paris. People came, not in droves, but in waves, thoughtful, curious, loyal. My mother flew in for the New York launch. She wore the same dress I gave her, the gray wool, and she cried when she saw my name above the window. I used to pray for you to have a soft life, she whispered, but now I know you needed the hard parts too. I held her hand. That night, as I walked home alone through the quiet city streets, I passed a group of women standing outside a restaurant. One of them was wearing a familiar lavender dress. Mine, the first one. The one that started everything. She didn't know me, but I knew her. And in that moment, I realized something important. That dress wasn't magic. It wasn't about the designer tag. It was about the woman who chose to wear it, even when no one believed in her, especially then. I turned the corner and walked into my building, my heels clicking in time with my heartbeat, and I smiled, because I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was here, exactly where I was always meant to be. I started receiving letters, not emails, not messages, handwritten letters. Women from across the country wrote to tell me they had seen me on stage, or read the article in the magazine, or just happened to try on one of my pieces and felt something shift inside them. Some were young girls unsure of who they were supposed to become. Others were mothers who'd forgotten what it meant to dress for themselves. A few were grandmothers, saying they finally found something that made them feel beautiful again without trying to be anyone but themselves. I kept them all in a box on my desk. On difficult days, I would open the lid and read one. Just one. It reminded me that this wasn't about fashion anymore. It never really had been. It was about reclaiming space. Years ago, I had walked into a room full of laughter meant to silence. Now I was building rooms for other women to be heard without saying a word. The lavender dress was retired now, folded neatly and stored in a fabric bag in the back of my closet. Not forgotten, just sacred. One morning, while organizing the racks in my workspace, I came across a sample I hadn't touched in months. It was a design I'd made right after the gala, structured, powerful, elegant, but I hadn't known what to call it. Now I did. I named it Resilience. When we released it, it sold out in days. I never marketed it as anything special, never told the story behind it. But the women knew. Somehow, they always knew. Then came the call I never expected. A documentary filmmaker from Europe. She wanted to make a short film about me, not just the designer, but the journey, the girl in the $40 dress, the woman who didn't shout but stayed. At first, I said no. I didn't want to be a spectacle. I didn't want people to turn my pain into entertainment. But she said something that changed my mind. Your silence speaks volumes, Ava. Let the world hear it. We began filming in the early spring. Small team, minimal setup. Just me, the city, and my story. She filmed me sketching, working with fabric, meeting with clients. She followed me back to the gallery where it all began. I walked her to the corner by the piano, the place I had once hidden while they laughed. It happened here, I said softly. And the camera caught it, the flicker in my eye that still remembered the sting. Did you ever think about giving up? She asked behind the lens. I nodded. Every day, but giving up would have meant they were right. There was a scene we filmed that I almost cut. A visit to my old apartment, the one I had shared with my husband. It was under renovation now, walls stripped bare, no trace of us left. I walked through the empty space like a ghost retracing its final steps. I used to wait by that window, I said, just to see if he would come home and look happy to see me. The filmmaker didn't say anything. She didn't have to. After filming wrapped, I returned to the rhythm of my work. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I was just building, creating, living. Then, about 2 months later, I received a formal envelope again, this time from the National Fashion Archive. They were curating an exhibit called Women Who Wore It First, featuring pivotal moments in fashion history where clothing intersected with courage. They wanted my lavender dress, the actual one, to be displayed with a plaque that read Eva Laurent. She wore it before it had a name. I cried, not a loud cry, just a silent stream of tears while holding the dress in my lap like a chapter of my life that had come full circle. I sent it in, and in exchange, they sent me a ticket, one guest, to the opening night. I brought my mother. We stood side by side in the gallery, watching people read the stories, touch the glass, lean in close. When they reached mine, I watched their eyes widen. They pointed, whispered. One woman looked at me. She didn't know who I was and said, "Can you imagine having that much bravery in a single night?" I smiled. My mother squeezed my hand. Later, as we walked through the rest of the exhibit, my phone buzzed. A message from a name I hadn't seen in a long time. My ex-husband. It simply read, "I saw the exhibit. You were always more than they let you be." I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I stared at the message for a long time, then turned off my phone. There was nothing left to say, not because I hated him, but because I no longer needed him to see me. I had seen myself. That was the only recognition I had ever truly needed. A few weeks after the exhibit opened, I visited it again. Alone this time. I didn't wear anything special, just jeans, a white blouse, and a coat I'd sewn myself. I wanted to walk through the gallery like any other guest. No makeup artist, no invitations, just me. The dress stood behind its glass, lit from above like a quiet relic of transformation. I watched strangers stop in front of it, read the placard, tilt their heads. Some nodded, others lingered. One young woman even took a deep breath and whispered to her friend, "I feel like I've been her." I smiled to myself and sat on the bench across the room. A little girl wandered up to the glass. She couldn't have been more than 8. Curly hair, bright eyes, mismatched socks. She pointed to the dress and asked her mother, "Why is that one so special? It's not even shiny." Her mother knelt beside her and said, "Because the woman who wore it changed everything, and not just for herself." That moment hit me harder than all the applause, headlines, and handshakes combined, because that's what I had always hoped for. Quiet change, not explosions, not headlines, just something small enough to settle into a girl's chest and live there until she needed it. I left the gallery with tears in my eyes and wind in my coat. That night, I got home and started designing again. Not for a launch, not for press, just for me, for joy, for peace. I started thinking about what came next, not just in fashion, but in life. I'd built something strong, rooted, but I wanted to grow it now, make space for others, uplift voices that hadn't been heard yet. I created a mentorship program under my brand, quietly. No huge campaign. I just reached out to 3 young women I had met through various events. One was from the Bronx, one from Tulsa, one from a small town in New Mexico. All of them talented, all of them overlooked. I brought them to my studio, gave them fabric, tools, and time. I didn't teach them how to copy me. I taught them how to see themselves as creators, as worthy. Watching them work reminded me of myself in those early days, hands trembling over cheap cotton, scared to waste even a single stitch. But they were brave. One afternoon, one of the girls, her name was Joy, asked if I ever felt like I didn't belong. I laughed softly. Not only did I feel it, I said, I was told it. She looked confused. Why didn't you stop? Because, I said, they only win when you leave the room. So I stayed and made my own table. Her eyes lit up. I knew she'd remember that. Later that summer, I received news I hadn't expected. My brand had been selected for a sustainability grant that would allow me to expand into ethically sourced materials from artisan women across Latin America. It was the kind of partnership I had always dreamed about, where my work could help others beyond the design. I flew to Oaxaca first, then Colombia, then Peru. I met weavers, dyers, craftswomen who'd been telling stories through fabric long before I'd ever held a needle. They didn't care about New York Fashion Week or capsule drops. They cared about color, about soil, about soul. We drank tea on dusty porches and traded stories through broken Spanish and gestures. I brought swatches home, not just fabric, but memory. And then I began designing my next collection, Rooted, each piece named after a word that had saved me: resilience, grace, silence, worth. The lavender color made a return, not because I wanted to repeat history, but because I finally owned it. When the launch date was announced, it sold out in pre-orders before the lookbook was even printed. Celeste sent me flowers with a note that read, "Now you're leading." I pinned that card on my wall. During one quiet morning before the chaos of the final production push, I walked to the mirror in my studio. I looked at myself, older now, sharper, stronger, but softer too. Not soft like weakness, soft like power that doesn't need to shout. And then I whispered something out loud. I'm proud of you. Not for what I had achieved, but for what I never let them take. The launch event for Rooted was held in a converted greenhouse on the outskirts of the city. It was quiet, filled with natural light, open windows, and climbing vines. No runway. Just women walking freely in the pieces, speaking with guests, laughing in corners, sipping tea from ceramic cups made by local artisans. Everything felt alive. The air, the light, the fabric. I had decided there would be no models this time, just real women, friends, mentors, clients, even my mother, each wearing the piece that resonated most with them. One wore grace. Another chose stillness. My mother wore home. She cried when she saw the label stitched inside, for the one who held me before I could stand. The crowd wasn't huge, but it was intentional. Women from shelters, artists from collectives, a few editors, no influencers, no red carpet, just community. I walked through the space with my hands behind my back, nodding, listening, learning. Every now and then someone would stop me and say, "You don't even seem nervous." I wasn't, because I had nothing to prove. That night, as the sky turned amber through the glass ceiling, I stood near the back and watched one of the guests trace her hand down the sleeve of Resilience. She didn't say a word, just closed her eyes and smiled. That's when I knew I had done it. Not won, not arrived, but healed. After the event, as we packed up, one of the volunteers handed me a small envelope. No stamp, no return address, just my name written in slanted cursive. I opened it in the quiet of my studio. It was from Lauren. I watched the live stream. I cried more than I want to admit. I saw your mother in the gray dress. I saw the way they looked at you. And for the first time, I wasn't jealous. I was just sad I never knew how to be soft enough to learn from you. I'm sorry. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same box as the others, the ones from women who had found pieces of themselves in my story, because even if hers came late, it still belonged there. We are all becoming. Some of us just take longer. I didn't write back, but I forgave her in my heart. That night, I made tea and sat by the window. I watched the lights flicker across the skyline and thought about the lavender dress. I realized I'd never actually thanked it. It wasn't just a dress. It was a mirror. It showed me who I was beneath the judgment, beneath the fear, beneath the silence. A few days later, I received another invitation. This one wasn't to a gala or a show. It was to speak at a university, my old one. They wanted me to give a talk to the graduating class, a short address, 10 minutes, on perseverance and creativity. I said yes. The auditorium hadn't changed much. Same creaky floor, same smell of old paper and dreams not yet broken. I stood on stage and looked at the sea of young faces, wide-eyed, expectant, brave, and I said, I used to think survival was about shrinking, about being small enough to go unnoticed so the world wouldn't crush you. But I was wrong. Survival is about growing anyway, even when no one waters you, even when they laugh, even when they say you're not made for this soil. I paused. They laughed at me once for wearing a dress that didn't belong. I let that land. But that dress was mine because I chose it, because I wore it before the world told me it had value. And now I make clothes that do the same for women who are still figuring out that they've always been enough. They stood and clapped. But I wasn't moved by the sound. I was moved by the silence right before it, the stillness where truth lived. After the speech, students came up one by one, clutching notebooks, some with tears in their eyes, others simply needing to say, "Thank you." A young man approached, nervously wringing his hands. He told me his sister had dropped out the year before because she felt invisible in every room she entered. He said my words made him want to tell her that she mattered, that she didn't have to wait for someone else to see her. I handed him one of my cards. "Tell her to come by the studio," I said. "We'll make her a piece she can wear like armor." He blinked, surprised. "Really?" "Of course," I smiled. "Visibility begins with a whisper." That became a new phrase I kept close. Visibility begins with a whisper. Because I had learned that sometimes the quietest presence in the room is the one everyone remembers after the noise dies down. Back at the studio, I told my team I wanted to offer open studio days, 2 Fridays a month, where women from underrepresented communities could walk in, talk to a designer, touch fabrics, even design something small for themselves. We'd fund it ourselves. No sponsors, no conditions. The idea spread quickly. Soon we had a line out the door every other Friday. Women came in with children, with tired hands, with eyes full of stories, and when they left, they stood taller. Sometimes they left with a scarf, a blouse, a sketch, but always with something more than they came in with. During one of those Fridays, I looked up from my table and saw someone I didn't expect. It was my former sister-in-law, Lauren. She stood at the threshold of the studio, awkward in her heels, her coat too polished for the mood. She held a thin folder in her hand. I walked over to her, not out of obligation, but out of peace. She looked around and said softly, "This place is more than I expected." I nodded. "I didn't come to cause anything," she added quickly. I wanted to show you something." She handed me the folder. Inside were sketches, not extraordinary but raw, honest. There was something searching in the lines, something that reminded me of myself in another life. "You drew these?" She nodded. "After your talk, I couldn't sleep for weeks. I kept remembering what you said about growing without being watered." I looked her in the eyes. "You've started. I don't know what I'm doing," she said, voice cracking, "but I want to try. I handed the folder back. Then you're already doing more than most. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for a decade. I didn't offer her a job, that wasn't the point. But I did tell her to come back on the next open studio day, to bring new sketches, to sit, learn, and fail with the rest of us. Because redemption doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in the choice to stay present after the mask comes off. Later that week, my mother came to visit. She brought a casserole like always and wore a new pair of earrings she said were completely unnecessary but utterly deserved. We sat on the couch in the back office, eating in silence, watching the last bit of sun pour through the wide window. You know, she said, they used to call me too proud at work. I looked at her. Because I didn't let people walk all over me. Because I stood up for myself. They made it sound like pride was poison. I took her hand. It's not, it's protection. She nodded. You wear yours well. I squeezed her fingers. After she left, I sat in the stillness of the studio, thinking about all the women I had become. The girl who was mocked, the wife who was overlooked, the designer who almost didn't speak, and the woman who finally learned that softness was not weakness, but wisdom in motion. I walked to the back of the room, pulled out my original sketchbook, the one with wrinkled pages and coffee stains, and opened it to the first design I ever made. It wasn't perfect, but it was brave. I decided then and there I would relaunch the lavender dress, one final time, limited release. A reimagined version using sustainable fabric, ethically dyed, with every piece numbered and signed. I called it the first laugh because that moment when they laughed at me wasn't the end of my story. It was the prologue. I worked on the first laugh in silence. No announcements, no teasers, no press leaks. Just long hours in the studio with the hum of the sewing machine, the rustle of fabric, the gentle scrape of pencil on paper. I treated every stitch like a memory, not to be relived but honored. I reworked the silhouette just slightly, sharper at the waist, deeper in tone, with a hidden pocket stitched inside the lining. On a tiny tag embroidered in soft gray thread were the words, "They laughed, she stood." The release was quiet. Just a few lines on our website, a single photograph, and a message that read, "For the ones who chose themselves before the world caught up." Within hours, it sold out. People didn't just want the dress, they wanted what it represented, a symbol, a scar turned into something sacred. Letters poured in again. One woman wrote that she wore it to her estranged father's funeral and finally felt strong enough to speak. Another wore it to resign from a job that had been breaking her spirit for years. A teenager wrote that she wore it to school on the day she came out. She said, "No one laughed, but even if they had, I wouldn't have folded." Each story was a stitch in something greater than fabric, a movement, a memory reclaimed. On the day the final dress was shipped, I walked back to the gallery where the original moment had taken place. It was raining, soft, cold, persistent, the kind of rain that made you feel like the sky remembered something. I stepped inside and saw that the piano was still there, tucked into the corner. I ran my fingers along the keys, not pressing them, just feeling the shape of the silence. And then I sat, same corner, same marble floors, same shadows, but a different woman. I stayed for a few minutes, letting it wash over me, the full circle of it all. I had once curled into myself in that very spot, pretending not to hear the cruelty. Now I sat like the architect of my own calm, untouched by the noise. Before I left, I slipped a folded note under the edge of the piano. It read, "She came back, not for revenge, but to forgive the room that once failed to see her." I didn't wait for anyone to find it. It wasn't for them. It was for her, for me. That evening, I met with my team at the studio to celebrate. Nothing grand, just candles, wine, laughter, and shared bread. We took turns sharing stories from our lives before Elon by Eva, each one revealing the journey behind the hands that had built our little sanctuary. One of my interns, Elena, barely 20, with a voice full of fire, stood up and raised a toast. To Eva, she said, for teaching us that sometimes you don't need to raise your voice. You just need to keep walking. I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I knew they didn't need me to tell them anymore. They had learned how to tell themselves. As the night wound down, I stood on the rooftop alone, looking out over the city. Lights flickered in windows like quiet poems. Somewhere below, women I'd never meet were opening boxes, unfolding the lavender dress, stepping into their own skin. And I whispered to the wind, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, just to the silence that held me when no one else did, just to the part of me that never let go. A month later, I received an invitation I never thought I'd see. The Fashion Conservatory in Milan, one of the most revered institutions in the world, was curating a seasonal showcase titled Threads of Defiance, and they wanted to feature the first laugh among global garments that had transcended fashion and entered the cultural memory. They described my piece as a silent rebellion stitched in grace. I stared at the email, blinking back a wave of emotion that rose too fast for words. It wasn't just the honor. It wasn't even Milan. It was that they had seen me. They hadn't asked who I knew. They hadn't asked what label I had trained under. They had seen the story and believed it mattered. I accepted the invitation. The showcase was set for October, which gave me time to prepare, but also to reflect. I began writing again, not essays, not marketing blurbs, just personal letters, pages of thoughts I'd never said aloud. I wrote one to the girl I used to be, another to my ex-husband, one to Celeste, and one to the version of myself who had almost left the gallery that night without ever knowing what would come. I didn't send any of them. I didn't need to. Writing them was enough. Meanwhile, my studio began to transform. We expanded to the unit next door, installed more windows, more workstations, hired 2 of the young women from the mentorship program full-time, and still, I kept one small table just for myself, a place where I could be quiet again, where creation wasn't business, it was breath. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the studio mirror, just a flash of movement, and I'd smile, not at the clothes or the brand or the accolades, but at the calm in my own eyes. That was new. One morning, while organizing archived pieces in our storage room, I stumbled across a forgotten box. Inside was the original shipping label from the $40 boutique where I had unknowingly bought the prototype. The paper was faded, the ink smudged, but it stopped me cold because written in tiny print at the bottom was something I had never noticed before. For the woman who chooses presence over approval. It hit me like a whisper from the past. Whoever wrote that, wherever they were now, they had planted a seed without ever seeing the tree, and I had grown it. Milan came quickly. I arrived alone, traveling light, just one suitcase. Inside, I carried the sample of the first laugh, pressed and packed with reverence, as if I were carrying part of my own skin. The conservatory itself was breathtaking. Arched ceilings, aged stone, silence that echoed with history. My dress was to be displayed in the center hall, beneath a skylight, with a single spotlight and a placard that told its story in 3 languages. The first time I saw it there, I couldn't move. It stood not as an object, but as testimony. A garment that once made people laugh now made them listen. During the opening ceremony, I stood at the back of the room, watching guests walk past it. They stopped. They stared. They leaned in to read. And no one laughed. One older woman, elegant, silver-haired, touched her chest and whispered to her friend in Italian, "This one, I feel like I've worn it in my own life. I didn't need a translator. I understood." After the event, I walked alone through the city. The autumn breeze tugged at my coat, and the cobblestones clicked beneath my boots like punctuation marks. I didn't shop, I didn't sightsee, I just wandered, letting the girl I used to be catch up, letting her walk beside me for a while. And in one quiet piazza, lit only by the glow of an old cafe sign, I sat down and wrote a final letter. This one was to the future, to the woman I hadn't yet become. Whatever you face next, remember this. You didn't build your life out of applause. You built it out of echoes that tried to erase you, and you kept singing anyway. When I returned home from Milan, everything felt quieter. Not smaller, not dull, just quieter, as if the volume of my life had finally settled into a calm I could live inside. There were no headlines waiting, no flashbulbs, just my apartment, a slightly overwatered plant on the windowsill, and a note from my assistant reminding me of Monday's production meeting. I made tea. I unpacked slowly. I hung the first laugh sample in the same place the lavender dress had once hung, on the back of my closet door, silhouetted by the morning light. But it wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. That night, I sat at my desk with my sketchbook open, but I didn't draw. I just ran my fingers along the edges of the page, thinking about everything that had shifted in the past year. Not just the brand, me. My body no longer braced itself in rooms. My voice no longer trembled in conversation. And my silence, my old companion, was no longer something I carried out of fear, but something I wielded like gold. A few days later, I received a request from a high school in my hometown. They were organizing a career week for young women and wanted to know if I'd be willing to come back and speak. Not to be celebrated, just to be real. To share what it looked like to fail, to start again, to build something meaningful from scraps. I said yes, of course I said yes. The gymnasium hadn't changed, still echoey, still too cold. Rows of foldable chairs and girls sitting in clusters, whispering in nervous voices. The teacher who introduced me looked exactly as I remembered. Kind, tired, sharp. When I took the mic, I didn't rehearse. I just breathed. I know what it feels like to think the world doesn't see, to think your name won't ever be printed on anything that matters. I know what it feels like to show up in something you chose with pride, only to be laughed at. I know how easy it is to believe them. I paused. But here's what they don't tell you. There's power in being underestimated. There's room to grow where no one is watching. And when you finally rise, no one can say they built you, because you built yourself. A girl in the second row wiped her eyes. Another started writing furiously. And just like that, I felt everything click again. After the talk, a girl came up to me. She looked no older than 16, with chipped nail polish and a tremble in her voice. "I wore my mom's old dress to prom," she said, eyes darting. They laughed, said it looked vintage, like it was an insult. But when I got home, my mom told me she wore it the night she decided to leave a man who didn't see her. I nodded, letting the tears rise in my throat but not fall. She said the dress helped her remember who she was, so I wore it. I don't regret it. "You shouldn't," I whispered. "That's what makes it couture." She smiled for the first time, teeth showing, eyes softening. I gave her a pin from my bag, one I had made for the Milan show. It was a small silver needle on a black backing card that read, "Made of more." She clutched it like it meant something, because it did. Back in the city, the studio continued to grow. We opened our first brick-and-mortar boutique, not in the trendiest district, not surrounded by luxury giants, but on a quiet street corner near a bookstore and a community garden. I wanted people to stumble upon it, not chase it. Inside, we didn't hang clothes on mannequins. We draped them on open frames like floating memories. We didn't use mirrors with harsh lights, just natural sunlight and one rule: no apologies in the dressing room. On opening day, we didn't throw a party. We baked bread. We brewed coffee. We invited the neighborhood. And women came, not just to shop, but to breathe. One woman sat in the corner with a dress folded on her lap and said, "I don't need this, I just wanted to hold it for a moment." "That's enough," I said. Sometimes fabric just reminds us we're real. That night, after closing up, I walked through the boutique alone, running my fingers along each rack. I paused at a soft ivory dress near the front window and smiled. It wasn't loud, but it was honest. And I thought, this is what legacy looks like. Not carved in stone, but stitched in story. A few months later, I was invited to be the keynote speaker at a design conference in Chicago. It was different from anything I'd done before. Not about fashion as image, but fashion as healing, as cultural language, as rebellion. The organizers said they wanted someone who understood how fabric could speak when words failed. I flew in the night before and stayed in a modest hotel. Nothing grand. I didn't need the distraction. I spent the evening going over my notes, then closing the notebook and choosing instead to write a letter to my younger self on hotel stationery. It started with, "You didn't imagine the laughter, but you survived it anyway." The next morning, I walked into the venue wearing a black pantsuit from my upcoming line. Simple, sharp. The lapel stitched with a single word on the inside, still. As I stepped onto the stage, the spotlight was warm. The audience quieted, waiting. I took a breath and began. I was once the woman in the room no one saw until they decided to mock me. And even then, they didn't see me. They saw what they feared. They feared simplicity. They feared softness that didn't beg for approval. They feared a woman who didn't shrink. A stillness fell over the room. I continued. Now I make clothes not to impress, but to remember. I make them for the version of you who stands at the edge of the room wondering if you belong. I make them so that you can wear your truth like fabric, so that no one else gets to define you, not by label, not by price tag, not by pedigree. I didn't cry, but the crowd did. When I stepped off the stage, a line of women waited for me, not to get autographs, but to say, "You told my story." I heard that phrase more than once, and each time I replied, because it was mine too. Back home, something strange began happening. People began sending me their own dresses, old ones, inherited ones, dresses worn to courtroom, funerals, weddings, interviews, dresses stained with memories, scented with moments. With each parcel came a letter. This is what I wore the day I asked for a divorce. This is the dress I was wearing when my daughter told me she forgave me. This one? I wore it when I walked into the boss's office and said, "You can't talk to me like that anymore." I stored them carefully, labeled each one, started a wall of them in my studio, on fabric forms, under glass, or folded in shadow boxes with the stories printed beside them. I called it the Quiet Archive, and I let visitors walk through it whenever they needed reminding that bravery didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it just needed to be worn. One afternoon, a woman came in holding a garment bag. She didn't speak much, just handed it to me and said, "You'll know what to do." Inside was a red dress, mid-length, sleeveless, slight tear at the hem. I pulled it out gently and waited for the story. She pointed to the tear. "That's where my son held on to me the day I left his father. He was 2. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I added the dress to the archive that evening, and beneath it I wrote, "Held," and still walked away. I began to understand something I hadn't before. that maybe this had never been about the dress at all. Maybe it had always been about who we become when we choose to show up, even when we are dismissed, laughed at, or told to be less. Maybe the moment wasn't when the designer pointed at me in the gallery. Maybe it was the one before, the one where I stood in the dress knowing they'd laugh and wore it anyway. The morning the archive reached its 50th dress, I arrived at the studio early, before the city woke up. The light hadn't yet warmed the windows. The air still held that soft hush before motion begins. I walked the aisle of garments, pausing at each one like a curator in a cathedral. Some were bold, bright silks, sequins, asymmetrical cuts. Others were modest, faded cotton, hems let out and pulled back in again. But all of them carried weight, invisible, the kind you feel in the chest, not the arms. And then I reached the lavender dress, not the replica, not the relaunch, the original, the $40 dress. The one I had worn before I knew what it meant to be seen, before the pointing, the laughter, the spotlight, before I'd become Eva Laurent. It was still intact, pressed, preserved. I removed it from the rack and stepped into the small dressing space in the back. I didn't need a mirror. I remembered every seam. It slipped over me like memory. And for a moment I closed my eyes and let myself become her again, not to relive the pain but to honor the choice. The girl who walked into a room full of polished strangers wearing nothing but self-belief. The girl who sat by a piano and didn't cry. The girl who heard them laugh and stayed anyway. I stepped out of the dressing room just as the sun broke across the windows. The beams lit the floor like a stage. But this time, there was no audience, no one to clap, no one to whisper, just me and the silence. And I danced, just for a moment, barefoot, slowly. Arms open like wings, not yet extended but already known. Not to perform, not to prove, but to release. Later that day, we hosted our usual open studio. The women came in, as they always did, tired, curious, hopeful. One of them noticed the lavender dress on the form near the window. She asked, "Is that the one?" I nodded. She stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "It looks softer than I imagined." "Because it is," I said. "Everything we survive becomes softer, eventually." She smiled and sat down to sketch. And I realized there would always be more stories. More women arriving in rooms where they weren't invited. More silent rebellions stitched in threads. More beginnings that look like endings. And that's when it truly hit me. They didn't laugh because of the dress. They laughed because I wore it without shame. Because I didn't ask for permission. Because I dared to believe I was already enough. And in doing so, I made it true. Years from now, no one may remember the fabric or the fit, but somewhere, someone will choose something soft and simple, something that feels like breath on skin, and she will step into her own moment, and maybe, just maybe, she'll remember a story she once heard of a woman who wore a $40 dress and changed everything. And now, if you've made it this far, maybe you saw something of yourself in this story. Maybe you were once laughed at too. Maybe you've stood in a room where no one clapped when you arrived. Maybe you wore your truth like a dress no one recognized. And maybe, like her, you stayed anyway. Because there is a kind of strength that doesn't roar, a kind that doesn't come from applause or titles, designer tags. It comes from silence, from grit, from every time you chose to walk forward, even when the world begged you to sit still. They thought the dress was the story, but the story was always the woman. The one who didn't shrink, the one who stitched her scars into fabric, the one who turned their mockery into momentum. So if you're listening to this right now, this is not just her story. This is yours. To every woman who was underestimated, to every girl who was told to tone it down, to every person who ever chose dignity over noise, let this be your reminder. You don't need validation to be valuable. You don't need their seat at the table when you can build your own. And you don't need the right dress to be seen. You just need to keep standing, keep becoming, keep walking, because the most powerful thing you'll ever wear is your decision to never let them define you. And if this story moved you, if you saw yourself in even a single word, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Send it. Let someone else know. They're not alone, because sometimes a quiet story can change everything.